For many of us, the hardest person to forgive is ourselves. For many of us, the hardest thing is to get past our own past. And I know I look barely old enough to have a driver's license, but I've actually been a pastor for going on 25 years. And I've had countless confidential conversations with people who feel chained with self-hatred, with condemnation, with this sense of this nagging, accumulating guilt that just weighs them down. And I've heard so many times people say, I know God forgives me, but I can't forgive myself. I know God forgives me, but I can't forgive myself. For one, it was an addiction that not only devastated their life, but their entire family. I know God forgives me, but I can't forgive myself. And maybe you're that one too. For one person, they had wandered away from their marriage and they had violated that sacred trust. And they're like, I know my spouse has forgiven me, but I can't forgive myself. And maybe you're that person too. For another, it was an abortion. And when this person thought of that baby, they found themselves overwhelmed with self-hatred. I know God's forgiven me, but I can't forgive myself. And maybe you're that one person too. Maybe you've ruined someone's career, or maybe you've lied to your closest friends, or maybe you're in a situation where you're on the other side of a strategic decision that you made. You drew a line in the sand, and on the other side of it, you know it was absolutely the wrong decision, and now it feels like it's going to define you the rest of your life, and there's this deep sense, God may have forgiven me, but I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to forgive myself. And in that situation, the guilt can just feel like chains. The psalmist describes it this way in Psalm 38, verse 4. He said, my guilt has overwhelmed me. It's overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy to bear. And what we do with our guilt, when we can't forgive ourselves, it literally is a matter of life and death. And there are standard operating procedures on how we deal with guilt that can go toxic. For example, here's one. Some people, they try to rationalize their guilt. They try to rationalize it. Here's a letter the IRS received from an anonymous taxpayer. I've cheated on my income taxes for the past 7 years. And tonight my conscience is troubling me to the point that I cannot sleep. I haven't closed a check for $1,000 as my way of saying I'm sorry. If I find that I still can't sleep, I'll send the rest of what I owe. And sometimes we just try to talk ourselves out of the debt that we owe. We try to minimize it, and figure, oh, I'll do a little bit of penance and then, kind of work this thing down a little bit. And that's one way, rationalizing our guilt. Here's another one. Sometimes we go even further and we just outright deny the guilt. We overcompensate. It's like, I don't have any regrets. I don't feel guilty about anything. I had a friend years ago who got pulled into this extramarital affair. And myself and all of her friends tried to surround them. And we're saying, come back home, come back home, come back home. But she didn't. She filed for divorce and just devastated her husband and her kids. And about 6 months later, someone said, you got to go check out this website. And I go there. And it's a picture of her and the person she had the affair with. And they are offering a curriculum that's called Guilt-Free Divorce. Guilt-Free Divorce. And I'm sitting there and I'm reading it, and the language is so hyperbolic and so positive. I literally felt like, is this a Saturday Night Live skit? Is this for real? And I remember at the end thinking to myself, there's one word that's stamped over every other word on this webpage, and it is the word denial. Denial. And denial eventually sneaks up on us. We get in that quiet place, maybe late at night when we can't sleep, and it comes back up. Doesn't work. Here's another one. Sometimes, if denying doesn't work, we'll just try to run from the guilt. We run to the bottle, or we run to another hit, or run to a night of sex, or run to mindless hours of television, or we run to the arms of Ben and Jerry and their sweet embrace. But the running doesn't work. I read this a couple weeks ago. This is from a Vietnam vet. He was sharing his story. He engaged in this personal act of vengeance on the mission field there, did something very evil. And the way he dealt with it is he ran to obsessive work, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this is what he wrote upon his retirement. He said, as soon as I retired and the 12-hour workdays ended, guess what came back up and started haunting me? My guilt over what I did in Nam. 40 years of running, and the second I stopped, it was right behind me. You know what these three so-called solutions have in common? They don't work. You know what else they have in common? All of us know from firsthand experience, they don't work. All of these so-called solutions end up going toxic. They end up actually enslaving us. And what do you do when you have guilt you can't get rid of? What do you do when you're regularly having this sense of self-hatred? What do you do when you say, well, I know God forgives me, but I can't forgive myself? Well, here's today's big idea. Self-forgiveness. It's fueled by two secrets that both have gospel solutions. And we're going to look at these. We're going to look at these secrets and how they can bring freedom and the gospel solutions that each secret is paired with. So where do you begin when you know God forgives you, but you can't forgive yourself? Well, write this down. Forgiving myself begins with remembering my biggest failures are not bigger than Jesus' forgiveness. Now listen, when I say, I know God forgives me, but I can't forgive myself, I just want to challenge that. I mean, if that's somewhere inside of you, I know God forgives me, but I can't forgive myself. I think if we did some reflection, if we started excavating and moving beyond intellectual assent down into the basement of our soul, what we would find when we're saying that is, well, I know God forgives me. I can check the box as sort of a theological truth, an abstract idea. But if we went way down into the basement of our soul, we would find that there's unbelief there. There's unbelief that God has totally, utterly, completely, forever forgiven us. And that's where we have to start the work. When you're dealing with self-hatred and a sense of condemnation, it can feel like the weight of my brokenness and the accumulated pile of what I've done is just overwhelmingly large. And Paul was writing to the church in Rome about this very issue, about the overwhelming weight of sin that just feels so suffocating. And I want you to see what he said to them in Romans chapter 5, verse 20. He says this, but where sin increased, grace increased all the more. Let's read it out loud together. Let's wake up our souls. Here we go. But where sin increased, grace increased all the more. Now, underneath the surface of this English translation, there are some interesting dynamics going on. You can see Paul uses the word increase twice to say sin increased and grace increased. And you would assume, because they're both translated as increase in English, that he was using the same Greek word underneath, but he wasn't. When it talks about sin increasing, he's using a mathematical term to talk about addition and multiplication, that it was adding up. The sin is adding up. But when he's talking about grace increasing, it's actually the Greek word for excess, abundant, overflowing. And he puts a prefix on it, and it's the word hyper. So he's saying when sin feels like it's piling up, get this, grace is super, ridiculously hyper abundant. It is overflowing, it will overwhelm, it is engulfing. You may feel like the wave of your sin is huge, but he's saying it isn't. God's grace is like a tsunami that will engulf and drown it. It doesn't even compare. He's saying this, grace is unstoppable. It is absolutely unstoppable. No matter how many sins you've added up and multiplied, grace engulfs and overwhelms them. There's no barrier that your sin can erect that will come even close to stopping the overwhelming, superabundant, ridiculously excessive flood of God's grace. If death and hell couldn't stop Jesus from giving you grace, nothing will. And he's also saying this, grace is unlimited. It's never depleted. It's never diminished. Unlike the fuel in your gas tank, unlike the milk in your jug, unlike the stupid battery on your phone, it will never run out. Endless refills. God isn't like doling out little amounts. It's like, oh, you've had your limit of grace. He's saying, no, endless refills. Just fill it up, drink it down. Fill it up, drink it down. It never, ever ends. And in other words, when Jesus said from the cross, it is finished, he meant it. That what he did on the cross, it's not just sufficient. It is super abundantly, ridiculously, excessively sufficient to by far outweigh, overwhelm, flood the biggest pile of mistakes that you can make. You can't outdo God's grace. And here's what's going on underneath this, is there's this secret unbelief that's fueling the self-hatred. I want to ask you to write this down. See, the lack of self-forgiveness, what it actually is a subversive self-righteousness. Now stay with me. I want to ask you to keep your defenses down, because it might be hard to hear, like, wait, you're saying when I have a hard time accepting myself and forgiving myself, I'm actually being self-righteous? That may feel like an attack. I don't mean it that way. I speak from a real tender place. Like, I know what it's like when you're feeling guilty about feeling guilty, and you don't want to talk to anyone about how guilty you're feeling, because they're going to tell you, stop being guilty, and then I'm going to feel even more guilty about feeling guilty. Anyone been there? Right? And it's like this weird cycle of just guilt. But what's going on underneath that is something pretty subversive. Because here's what I've realized. You know, when I'm saying I can't forgive myself, I know God's forgiven me, but I can't forgive myself. You know what? That self-hatred, that condemnation, it's almost like a religious experience. Think about it. It almost feels pious. It's like, you know what? I need to punish myself. I do. I need to pay penance. I deserve this. I should suffer. And it feels religious. It feels pious. But what it actually is self-righteousness. See, what I'm actually saying to Jesus when I say, I know you forgive me, but I can't forgive myself, is this. What you did, your perfect life, your work on the cross, your death, your suffering, your conquering resurrection, it's not enough. It's not sufficient. Actually, my sin is bigger than that. My sin is bigger than your grace. I'm going to have to punish myself. I'm going to have to suffer. Sorry, Jesus, what you did wasn't enough. I'm going to have to add to it with my own righteousness by punishing myself. And although you're God, my opinion's actually superior to yours, because you said it is finished, and I'm saying I don't agree. I need to add to it. And when I say I know Jesus is forgiving me, but I can't forgive myself, what we're actually saying is, Jesus, you said it is finished, but I don't think so. And here's a jiu-jitsu move, a spiritual jiu-jitsu move that may help you be freed up. You know what self-forgiveness actually is? It's a faith-filled act of obedience. When I forgive myself, I honor what Jesus did. When I forgive myself, I say, Lord, I trust your verdict is the right verdict. You said it is finished. You say I'm forgiven. I choose your opinion over mine. When you say, I will forgive myself, what you're doing is you're expressing gratitude to Jesus for what he did for you. And when you say, I can't forgive myself, Jesus, I know you're forgiving me, but I can't forgive myself, you need to understand, he doesn't take any pleasure in that. He is grieved. What he's saying to you in that moment is, don't live beneath the privilege that I purchased for you. I read years ago in the newspaper about a homeless man who died under a bridge, malnourished, in rags. And the reason this was in the paper is because when they traced his identity, they discovered that he had almost $1 million in his bank account. He had inherited a family fortune, and he knew about it. But because of a mental illness, he never cashed a check, and he died hungry and in rags. And what I'm saying to you is, if you're experiencing self-hatred and you don't know how to forgive yourself, your Father is saying, listen, the bank account is full. Cash the check. Don't live beneath the privilege that your big brother Jesus purchased for you. The inheritance is there. It's yours. Cash the check. The bank account is full of amazing grace. And when you do, you are expressing gratitude and praise and worship and obedience to Jesus. So here's the gospel solution. See, all forms of forgiveness, including self-forgiveness and the forgiveness of others, find their source in God's forgiveness of us. That's where it begins. Ephesians 4:32 has become our theme verse in this series. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving one another, because you're such an awesome person that you can do that all by yourself. No, how does it happen? Just as God in Christ forgave you. That's the source. And then look at Mark 12:31. Love your neighbors yourself. You add these two passages together, you mash them up, and you know what you get? Forgive yourself. You've got this endless bank account of God's forgiving first love, and we are able to let go of the self-hatred, the pesky regrets, the nagging guilt, and fully accept ourselves. We are people who are fallible and flawed, but we are forgiven and we are precious in His sight. And when that voice of condemnation and self-hatred starts screaming in your head, go back to what we talked about in the last series, gospel fluency. That's where you go back and say, no, God is gracious. I don't have to prove myself. God is gracious. I can forgive myself just as Christ has forgiven me completely, totally, utterly, and forever. And I will not be defined by this mistake. I will not let this mistake define my identity. And that leads to the second secret. You're going to want to write this down. See, forgiving myself begins with remembering I am not what I've done. I am who God says I am. You are not what you've done. And what happens is a lot of times when we've committed this act that has caused so much pain and regret and self-hatred, we begin to internalize it, and it ceases to be a deed and it becomes an identity. And it moves from guilt to a much more toxic, chronic situation. See, here's what guilt is. I did bad. And there's been volumes of research done on the nature of guilt. And get this might surprise you. You know what the research bears out? That people who have healthy relationships actually experience guilt. Guilt's a good thing. It's supposed to be a temporary motivator, and it's a recognition that you violated a relationship with another person, or maybe with God, and it moves you towards reconciliation. So what they found out in the research that people who experience brief and intense moments of guilt end up with actually happier relationships. But here's what happens. We start internalizing the guilt, and we try to rationalize it or deny it or run from it. And then when it gets internalized, it becomes something else, and it's called shame. And write this down. See, guilt is I did bad, but shame is I am bad. And here's the slippery slope of shame. We connect the what with the who. So, for example, it's like I committed adultery. And what happens is now that becomes an identity. I am an adulterer. And I forever, when I look in the mirror, see a scarlet A. And what I did becomes my identity. And it works like this. It starts with I did bad, therefore I am bad, and here's where it ends up. Therefore, I am worthless. You can plug a lot of different words in there. You know, I'm insignificant, I'm disgusting, I'm unlovable, I'm permanently damaged, I'm dirty. And you know what those words are that you struggle with. And see, shame is a soul-crushing, identity-warping emotion. And if you're wondering, is this something I deal with? Well, let me give you 3 indicators. Here's the first one. A vulnerability to perfectionism. You know, if life for you feels like an Olympic event where you have to constantly keep score and you have this sense of urgency, like I need an error-free performance, and it's very difficult to admit your failures because inside you know you're running on this treadmill as hard as you can to try to prove that you are worth it. And if that's you, shame's got a grip on you. Here's another one. A propensity to be critical of ourselves, which makes us critical of others. So what happens is we see our faults mirrored in other people, and it drives us crazy because we hate it in ourselves, and there's this weird cyclical critical spirit of yourself and others, yourself and others. Some of you are wondering, it's like, why is Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas dinner so hard? Because your family is caught up in this cycle of shame. It's like, why does mom keep criticizing me? You know, and it drives you crazy. It's because mom is dealing with this lifelong situation of shame. And then, oh, there's dad or my brother, and now he's got, drunk and he's disengaged and he's falling asleep. Well, why is he doing that? Because shame is telling him he's not worth it. He can't be involved with the family. He needs to basically put himself in the penalty box, And there's all these dynamics. And one of them is that critical cycle. And here's another one, a tendency toward self-defeating thoughts as a form of protection and escape. And one of the things we end up doing is sabotaging opportunities and relationships because we're punishing ourselves. Do you find yourself unconsciously doing that where you're like, oh, I blew this opportunity again. This is like the fourth one. Or I blew this relationship and now I'm going on the fifth one. And see, that's shame. You're actually maybe unconsciously punishing yourself because it's like, I don't deserve this opportunity. I don't deserve this relationship. And see, shame is one of the most devastating, life-sucking forces in a human soul. And God's people have wrestled with this from the very beginning. You remember Israel, they were slaves for more than 400 years. Imagine that. Your parents were slaves, your grandparents were slaves, your great-grandparents were slaves, and you've been told generation after generation after generation, you are subhuman. The only value you have is how many bricks can you make and how fast can you make them. And so it's this deep label, a shameful label. I am a slave. And one of the things, the greatest things that they needed to be liberated from wasn't just their literal slavery, but also this internal slavery to shame. And look at what God says over his people in Isaiah 54. He says, fear not, you will no longer live in shame. Don't be afraid. There's no more disgrace for you. You will no longer remember the shame of your youth. And you know the story. God raised up Moses. He went to Pharaoh and said, let my people go. And there were the plagues. And then they were liberated. And they went out into the desert. And they lived happily ever after. No way. One of the reasons they had to go into the desert, it was detox. They were out of Egypt, but Egypt wasn't out of them. They were out of slavery, but slavery wasn't out of them. And God was saying, you are my people. You are the light of the world. You're a nation of priests. And they just didn't believe it. It's like, no, we're not. We're slaves. And we sit in that same situation today where a lot of us have a label that we created or someone gave to us. And I want you to see the secret unbelief. Write this down. See, a lack of self-forgiveness means we are still believing that we're something that God says we are not. And you see there's a question there. What is the label that shame is giving you? Maybe it's adulterer. Maybe it's drunk. Maybe it's fool. Maybe it's a label someone gave you. One of my friends growing up, his dad was verbally abusive, and his nickname for him was stupid. Can you believe that? So hundreds and thousands of times through his childhood, stupid, stupid, stupid. And he said with tears in his eyes to me, he's like, the greatest thing that Jesus set me free from is that label, stupid. And I wonder what it is for you. I know one of them for me is just these three words, not good enough. Not good enough. Like my family, on one side there was functional alcoholism, and the other side there was like verbal and emotional abuse, and then that kind of came into our immediate family, and the primary way that we dealt with it was like control and perfectionism. And so the voice in the back of my head, and I think it's been operating in my family for generations, is like, not good enough, it's never good enough, it's not good enough, it's never good enough, and it's like a slave master, not good enough. And I wonder if you would have the courage right now to write down what your label is, if you know it. Because actually naming it is the beginning of freedom. Because you know what? You're not in Egypt anymore. If you've trusted Jesus, you're not in Egypt anymore. But Egypt may still be inside of you. And I want you to see the solution, because this is the good news. The only way to heal from shame is to move the focus from what I'm not to who Christ is. In other words, In Jesus, identity is not found in my roles, but in my relationship with God. Identity is not found in my activity, but actually in amazing grace. My identity isn't found in what I've done. It's found in what Jesus has done. It's not about me earning and striving. It's because of what Jesus has done that I can now forever know who I am, that I'm situated in his mercy, in his love, and his grace forever, that I am now accepted, forgiven, that I have a new name and a new identity, and that what Jesus thinks about me will never change because it's not based on my behavior or my performance. It was settled when he said, it is finished, and when you received it, it is now forever yours because of his faithfulness, not yours. And here's just some highlights. Here's what Jesus thinks about you. Here's what you can say. In Jesus, I am God's beloved child. In Jesus, I'm a friend of God. I'm a whole new person with a whole new life. I'm a place where God's Spirit lives. I'm God's treasure. I am totally and completely forgiven. I'm a citizen of heaven. I'm the light of the world. I'm more than a conqueror. Imagine if you could get up in the morning and look in the mirror, and not with any arrogance, but a sense of gratitude, and say, hey, you know what, dude? You're the light of the world. Hey, you know what? You're more than a conqueror. Hey, you know what? You're beloved. And I want to tell you something. I didn't tell any other services this. This was about 5 years ago. There was a friend who led me through a lot of this deep kind of soul work, counseling and prayer. And we had been through a particularly difficult set of like childhood experiences that told me I'm not good enough. And we prayed together, and I just hope in my heart, I said, Lord, I want to trust what you say about me. And then I got home. And on the mirrors of the house, there was written in childhood handwriting verses like light of the world, God loves you. And I'm like walking around the house, and there's like with soap, there's been written on all the mirrors these phrases about who we are in Christ. And I went and found Belle. She was like probably 6 or 7 at the time. I said, honey, what are you doing? And she told me, Jesus told me to write these for you. I am no longer a slave. I am a child of God. And listen, I'm nothing special. This is available to every single person in this room. And I want to ask you to listen to these words from Joshua 5:9. Again, this is the Lord speaking over Israel. He says, today, can you circle that word? Today I have rolled away the shame of your slavery in Egypt. Can everyone say today? Come on, today. And maybe you're here and you've been thinking, well, once I pay enough penance, or after 12 years of counseling, or whatever it is. No, today. And there may be voices that have said, shame on you, but your Father is saying, shame off of you. And I just think in this series, there's been something special happening. I think there's freedom growing. That there's more and more of us that are actually believing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in moments like this, it's important to mark the moment. And if you look again in your bulletin, you'll see there's a little letter there. Can you go ahead and grab this? We're going to mark this moment. And it says, choose forgiveness. And the band's going to come up, and we're going to give you some space. We're not in a hurry. We're not in a rush. And they're going to play in the background. And you know what? Thoughts disentangle themselves through our lips and our fingertips. And I want to ask you to disentangle your thoughts. What is it that Jesus has been saying to you in this journey into choosing forgiveness? You know, week 1, we talked about how there's a choice whenever we're hurt or offended. And one road leads to bitterness and the other one leads to freedom. And maybe Jesus has spoken to you about a grudge that you've been nursing for a long time, and you know that. And it's time to choose forgiveness. It's time to start the process of forgiving that person. You know, Dan talked a couple of weeks later about how when we're hurt and offended, sometimes we blame God and we hate God when we actually need to trust God. And maybe that's what Jesus has been speaking to you about. You know, Doug talked last week about how our families are the place where we often get hurt the deepest. And maybe you need to forgive a sibling or a parent, or maybe you need to go to a sibling or a parent and ask forgiveness. What is Jesus speaking to you about? And maybe today it's time to reject the label, the slave name, and to receive your divine name, the new name that Jesus is giving to you. So during these next moments, you might want to write it as a prayer, like actually write it to your Heavenly Father. Or you might want to write it as a letter to yourself. And here's what we're going to do at the end. We're going to ask everyone to seal these up and deposit them in the containers, the black boxes on the way out. So what you're going to do is you're going to self-address it. No one's going to read this. You're going to self-address it. And on a mystery date in the future, we're going to mail this back to you. It's going to be a grace bomb in your mailbox. And you know what? Everybody loves to receive a personal handwritten letter, especially from their favorite person themselves. So you'll get to look forward to receiving this. So let's take advantage of this moment and write our letters and write our prayers.
I'm no longer a slave to fear. Lord, I am a child of God.
Well, I just want to remind you to self-address it. And this is at all locations. Drop this off on the way out in the containers so we can send these back to you. And if you didn't have a chance to finish it, you can stay, you can hang, you can finish your letter. You don't have to be in a hurry. I also want to remind you next week to remember to bring your Thanksgiving offering cards. We're going to have an incredibly meaningful moment of worship, of gratitude and offering. And so I want to encourage you to pray this week to ask Jesus what he would have you to give. And I want to ask you all to stand your feet together. And I want to remind us at all locations that we'll have prayer partners available at the front. And they would love to lift your request in partnership and solidarity with you to the Father. And let me just say this. We've got to end this with a celebration. Speedway, we are so excited about the brand new space in Piper. It's a huge kingdom breakthrough. Woo! Yeah! Woo! Yeah! We are so proud to be a part of what God is doing in you and through you. Woo! We celebrate with you. Woo! Yeah! And let's go now, celebrating that because of what Jesus has done, we are not defined by our mistakes, but defined by the grace of God. And all God's people said, amen. Go in grace and peace.